Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert was someone who probably came along in the wrestling business a generation too soon. A good talent who was too small to strike it big in a major promotion when size was still very important, and a great mind for the business as a booker. He was a third generation talent, even though he's mostly written about as a second generation star. His father was a wrestler, but so was his grandfather. He used to wrestle in the carnival days. So wrestling was in his blood from the time he was born. He even no-showed his high school graduation so that he could wrestle on an independent show. This is somebody who loved wrestling, even though it didn't always love him back. And he didn't love himself enough to take good care of himself enough, which is why he died very young at 33 years old of a massive heart attack. Some of the talking heads in his episode of Dark Side of the Ring included Jim Cornette, who's become really the most important historian on these episodes, and was friends with Eddie before either of them even got into the wrestling business. They used to shoot photos at the matches, which is how they met. Eddie's brother, Doug, is interviewed. Mick Foley, Ricky Morton, Dutch Mantell, and Medusa, who was married to him for all of 4 months. But they are some of the people that were interviewed for this. They also had video and audio of Eddie himself from his own shoot interview. I think it was one, maybe it was multiple ones, but he had to be among the first to even do a shoot interview because this one was done, I want to say in 93 or 94 are the clips that we get here. You didn't find too many people doing shoot interviews back then. Now, I'm not an Eddie Gilbert guy in that I didn't see any of him growing up as a wrestling fan. He's one of those names I became familiar with many years later. His father, Tommy Gilbert, was very popular in the Tennessee territory back in the 60s. Eddie was working as a photographer, which is how he worked his way into the back. Very similar to how Paul Heyman got into the business. I said Ricky Morton was interviewed for this. He was good friends with Eddie. I think he said that he was Eddie's best friend. The two of them were involved in the second ever Tupelo concession stand brawl, which is notable for Atsushi Onita's involvement, because that was the match that gave Onita the inspiration to go back to Japan and adopt that hardcore style of wrestling many years later into what would become FMW. Eddie Gilbert was part of that match. Not long into this, they get into Eddie's brief run in the WWF, which was pretty much as an enhancement guy, until a major car accident on his way back from a TV taping. It changed his life forever and likely contributed to his death later on. He was hit from behind by a truck, and he suffered a broken neck. He almost died in intensive care. He was told that he would never wrestle again, which obviously he did. But what wasn't really talked about when he came back was the fact that he bruised his heart in the accident. He got driven into the steering wheel right above his heart. And Dutch Mantell says Eddie told him his heart was like jello after that. And yet 3 months later, he was back in the ring wrestling. So from that point on, his heart was weaker than it used to be and may have played a part in his death, in addition to all the other things he was doing, which didn't do his heart any favors, like the drugs and the steroids, which he took to try to get bigger. If he was naturally 170, 180 pounds, on steroids, he would be up over 200 pounds, which is what he was. He later admitted to using steroids during the Dr. Zahorian trial. And there he is again, good old George Zahorian. The boys have to have their candy. Eddie was in so much pain from the broken neck that between that and the steroids, Zahorian was supplying him with whatever he needed. Pain pills galore. But with the Hogan era starting up, there was, no way that somebody who looked like Eddie Gilbert was ever going to be pushed like a star there. So that was the end of his time in the WWF, and he ended up back in Memphis as a heel. And he actually got his first shot at booking shows while working for Bill Watts in Mid-South. Then Mid-South sells to Crockett, which then sells to Ted Turner, which is how Eddie ended up as part of WCW's creative team. But they had a booking committee at the time, which is a recipe for disaster. When you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen. Too many cooks in the kitchen is never a good thing. Ric Flair made a power play to head up this committee. Flair didn't know much about Eddie Gilbert, so when he booked him to lose to Ron Simmons one night, it was in Memphis of all places. Eddie didn't want to lose in Memphis, so he changed the finish. Flair finds out about this. He flips out, and he calls up Jim Cornette to bitch about it, and he wanted Eddie gone. So he offered Eddie's spot on the committee to Jim Cornette, who was good friends with Eddie Gilbert. And Eddie felt betrayed by this, and he ended up back in Memphis. And this is where we got the famous angle where Jerry Lawler got run over by a car driven by the Gilbert brothers. I've talked about this on the podcast multiple times before. This is the first thing I think of whenever I hear the name Eddie Gilbert. It was September 1st, 1990. It's a classic Memphis wrestling angle. The USWA, they held a live 2-hour show every Saturday morning. And Eddie Marlin, he was the general manager in the USWA. He quote-unquote fired Eddie and his brother in storyline. And he escorted them both out of the studio into the parking lot. And they were arguing with Eddie Marlin when Jerry Lawler comes out to go chase them off. So Eddie and his brother Doug, they get into their car, which actually belonged to Brian Lee's girlfriend at the time, the same Brian Lee who would go on to play the fake Undertaker in WWE. They get into this car, which doesn't actually belong to them, and they've never driven before. And they start driving towards Lawler. And Eddie Marlin got the hell out of the way, but Lawler just stood there, and he jumped up as the car approached, and he hit the windshield. He smacked the windshield, and he bounced off the car. He landed on the concrete right on his hip, and he rolled a few times, and the car sped off. It looked bad. It looked great if you were trying to make it look realistic, because it was. Okay, it looked bad for Jerry Lawler. And Doug Gilbert's in the car telling Eddie as they're speeding off, "I think you killed him." Because he didn't expect the car to go as fast as it did. He realized afterwards that, he should have driven the car first just to get a feel for how powerful it was. So now here, Eddie thinks he just killed his idol. Because this man worshipped Jerry Lawler when he was getting into the business, and now he may have killed him. So the fans watching live were panicked. I think Lawler dislocated his hip. At least one fan in the studio called an ambulance. Other fans called the cops. They came to the studio looking to arrest Eddie Gilbert. And it was real enough that Lawler had to go back out in front of the crowd later on in the taping and let them know that he was okay so that the cops wouldn't arrest Eddie. And Lawler, begged Eddie Marlin, please reinstate them so that he can get his revenge. Lawler is lucky he wasn't killed. But the best part about the entire thing was later in that episode, if you can find it, and I'm pretty sure it's on YouTube, they had a guy in a Ninja Turtles costume named Cowabunga come out and tell Dave Brown that what happened to Lawler was totally bogus. Totally bogus, dude. I'm telling you, Memphis was something else, man. Memphis was a trip. Totally bogus, dude. You might even say the king was shell-shocked by the whole thing. I'm just saying. So they talked about, it's terrible, I'm sorry, but they talked about his relationship also with Missy Hyatt. The two of them were married for about a year and a half. Missy was a smoke show back then. He pulled Missy Hyatt and Medusa. The man was doing something right in his life. Either that or he was packing, whatever it was. But Medusa said the marriage, brief as it was great, but by the end, he just wasn't the same man that she fell in love with. And he would fall asleep at his food sometimes. He was so fucked up. His addiction had taken over his life. Flash forward to the early 90s. There's a new promotion out of Philadelphia called ECW. And Todd Gordon, who founded ECW, worked with Eddie to help get the company off the ground. Gordon says that without Eddie Gilbert, there is no ECW, which is likely very true. Enter Paul Heyman, who was learning how to book shows by watching and learning from Eddie Gilbert. And Heyman has said that Eddie was his mentor and he was his best friend at the time. 6 months into his run there, Eddie starts showing up late to shows. And his attitude changed, and Heyman said he wasn't the same guy that he became friends with. Eddie walked out on them 5 days before a major show. And when he later apologized, they told him he was already replaced, like it's too late. And Eddie asked if he could still come to the show and address the fans and thank them. And when he did, Heyman got paranoid that Eddie was about to screw him in some way, so he told him to cut his mic. And that was the end of the relationship between Paul Heyman and Eddie Gilbert. They never spoke again after that. And it was after that that Heyman took the reins and he rebranded ECW from Eastern Championship Wrestling to Extreme Championship Wrestling. And where things really deteriorated with Gilbert and Heyman, and Paul talked about this years ago on Steve Austin's podcast, was just a difference in their booking philosophy. He said Eddie had great ideas, but they weren't original. He wanted to recreate angles that he saw done in Memphis years earlier when he was younger, but just kind of tweak them and put his own spin on them. He was more of an old school wrestling guy, and he wanted to make ECW a more Memphis style promotion. whereas Heyman wanted to try something new, and he wanted to take things in a more hardcore direction. So basically, Eddie wanted to rehash things but update them. Heyman wanted to start from scratch with new ideas, and we see who won out on that one and who Todd Gordon backed on that. Cornette brings Gilbert in at that point to Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and that doesn't last long before he leaves for a chance to book for Carlos Colon's promotion in Puerto Rico. And Cornette says after that one TV taping that he brought him in for, he never saw Eddie Gilbert again. 3 months later, he was dead. He booked himself against the Wrestling Bear. He was going to wrestle an actual bear. And the next day, he was found dead in his apartment. And to be fair, if I had to wrestle a bear, I probably would have had a heart attack too. But that's how things ended for Eddie Gilbert. And it's been 30 years since Eddie Gilbert died. It's impossible to know what kind of impact he would have had nationally. By most accounts, he was a student of the game. He loved wrestling very much. It was his entire life. He was a fine wrestler. I mean, he was better than average, but he always got praised as a booker more than anything else and as a finish guy. So if he had his head screwed on right, in ring, I don't know that he would have gone on to become, like a major star or anything like that, but he would have ended up probably back in WCW or back in WWE working maybe more so in a behind the scenes capacity, and he could have contributed that way. But he had his demons, as most everybody does in this series. And that played a big role in why he never made it to his 34th birthday.